Welcome back to Dungeons and Drama Nerds, a podcast where we explore the intersection between theater and tabletop role-playing games. I'm Todd Backus, here with Percy.
Hi.
And Nick.
Hey.
As well as a special guest, James Patefield, an actor, director, and deviser here in Portland, Maine.
Hi, everyone.
So this week we're here discussing devised theater and tabletop games, and I wanted to talk to James in particular because he's devised a lot of work with Bear Portland here in Maine over the last 5 years or so. So James, can you tell us a little bit about your background as a devising artist?
Absolutely. So I started devising in college as part of... So I think it also comes to talking about like where devising comes from too, that I sort of came at devising from an improv background and a commedia dell'arte background. And so when I was studying abroad in Italy, I got to study under some great folks who are excellent practitioners in what is essentially devising craft. So devising through commedia, devising through improv, devising through clown. And then I started applying those lessons once I got out into the world. And so with Bear Portland, the company that I was a part of here in Portland, we devised one full performance of the Yellow Wallpaper, which was in 2017. And then this past year, I directed our production of a project called Storage, which was a full year long, partially devised. Well, it was devised throughout every step of it, but it was, we bought the contents of a storage unit at auction and then made a piece of performance and an immersive installation based off of what we found inside. Yeah, that's sort of my background on it.
Yeah. And for listeners who aren't super familiar with devised theater, can you kind of describe it from a foundational level? Like, what's the difference between devised theater and what someone might think of as like more traditional, air quotes, theater?
Totally. I think that if we're going to put it in like historical context, the devised theater is sort of a rebellion against the traditional, more modeled after capitalism, traditional power structure of theater making. So instead, it decentralizes power from the director to everyone involved in the project. So in an ideal space, it's actors, performers, designers, the director, or like the editor coming together and creating something organically through various exercises, stitching all of that together into a finished product that is like a set thing, but is creating something out of quote unquote nothing. And yeah, it's got the precedence in like Jerzy Grotowski and Bertolt Brecht, and it ends up sometimes having like a weird cult of personality around these problematic white men historically. But also, it's borne out in the Worcester Group and
Frantic Assembly?
Yes, Frantic Assembly. And so it's all of these organizations that are sort of built around this collaborative performance making.
So we sent you the audio from John Session 0.
Yes.
And to me, I think it's like a devising for tabletop 101.
Absolutely.
The way John sets up the first session, or session 0 rather, I think is a really fantastic approach to how do we come together to tell a story, and how do we set like useful rules and boundaries around those things to make like the work that we're doing both focused and fun.
Yes, completely.
And so some of the things that John talked about are like, what are the stories that we're interested in telling? What are the things we want to explore? What are the things we want to avoid? And I think that like I try to make my rehearsal rooms really open for collaboration by acknowledging that like as a director, which is often the role that I'm in, like I don't have all the answers. I don't expect to have like a perfect vision of the play. I have some ideas and like we'll see where they go. But getting to listen to John's approach was really like, oh, this, like I could do even more. I could be even like wider in this. And I'm wondering, as someone who is both a theater maker and a tabletop player, what are some things that you think tabletop players could learn from devising practice?
I think I think it's the sense of play. And I was so heartened by John drawing those clear, healthy boundaries around like what stories do we want to tell, what stories do we not want to tell. Because I think, that's definitely something I want to seal both in theater making and in tabletop playing, that like it sort of gave me this sense of galaxy brain, because, one of the aspects of D&D that's always made me feel so iffy and gross are like the racial dynamics and how you basically get pigeonholed into encountering fantasy racism no matter what, unless you're a human, ironically. But John also was so intentional about getting into specific, like leaving room for the players of the game to have specific reactions, like painting out enough of an outline so that you have some rules to rebel against, and also some rules to support you. And we'll talk about mechanics later, but yeah, like being able to go past like very generic hooks and knives into something that's much more specific, that allows you to tell a much richer story. And it's also something that's a little more idiosyncratic too, because you get to, I love John's whole idea of like the rule of cool. And in the room, I often, when we're devising, my go-to phrase will be, "That's so dumb." It's so dumb. I love it. Because with devising work, you're ideally able to get past, like you're not trying to make something quote unquote polished or good or like super finished in the room. And as soon as you can like get away from taking it super seriously, the more rich what you make will be.
I'm thinking about what you said about devising as a revolt against capitalism, and I'm thinking about what we're talking about now in terms of just like things don't have to be super and I'm thinking about like, this is a game set in the apocalypse. Do you think that the setting is helpful at all in terms of like, theoretically we're in a world where all the structures we know have collapsed? Like, do you think that freed us up a little bit more to do weird, dumb shit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely connected. And the other phrase from Session Zero that really, really stuck out to me is the idea of like apocalyptic pragmatism. That like let's not gild this lily too much. Like let's take a direct path. And it also empowers all of you as players to make your own choices, because John as GM or
Master of Ceremonies.
That's right. And it's again deconstructing like the GM role a little bit, where in traditional D&D it could be like the GM is God, but really no, the GM is just sort of trying to wrangle all of these different ideas and edit them together in a way that is seamless and enjoyable for the players.
I read something recently that it seemed pretty like common sense to me, but there were people, it was like on Reddit, it popped up, and it was like, you're not playing for your players as a GM, you're playing with your players. And there were a lot of people who were like galaxy braining about this and thinking like, oh, this is like not how I think of GMing. I think of like, I'm setting up a thing so that they can play. And instead thinking about it as like, no, you just have a different role, but you're also playing. Like it is your job to help facilitate a cool experience, but like it's also your job to have fun in that.
Yeah, which is why I come back to like, improv's roots or devising's roots in improv. It's all about yes-anding, and like with improv, you don't want a character to really overtake another character and shoot down their ideas and really railroad them in a particular direction of the plot. You want to build that collectively, and that's the really exciting thing about it, is that you can map it out as much as you want as a GM, but you have no idea where any given session will necessarily go, or you've got bits and pieces that you can throw in as needed, but it's almost never where you initially intend it to be. And I remember as Percy and Nick, I'm sure you know, but for Todd's and my D&D group, our friend Johnny was the Act 1 DM. I took over as Act 2, and now Todd is doing Act 3. When I was prepping for my stint, I think it was one of those Matt Mercer Geek and Sundry videos where it was okay, the next step of DMing is just let your players describe what this world is. Let it be no need to necessarily even when painting a word picture fall back on what your vision of it is, because at the end of the day, the players are who are inhabiting this world.
I think there's a real movement in tabletop games in that direction of more increased player agency and shared agency over the world and the narrative. We saw that a little bit with Apocalypse World, but as I read more and more games, increasingly built into the structure of the game itself are these expectations and ways to enable people to create the world as players. And even in some cases, people are creating games now that are completely lacking a GM, that are just for two players in the same role without a GM, or even for one player sometimes without a GM. And I think that cross-pollination that also happens, I think, between devised theater and more quote unquote traditional theater is really interesting to see and really healthy.
Yeah. And it reminds me of that new game it's not a new game, but it's been around for years, but it's new to me. I think it's Fable, where essentially you end up having the players create their own movesets, essentially. And, initiative is entirely dictated by, okay, who wants to go? And that different approach to mechanics, I think, is really rich and exciting.
Yeah, and from a player perspective, it was really refreshing, for the GM figure to not be super precious about because he brought us this here's what I have, but we had the agency to flesh out aspects of it based on what was convenient for what we wanted to do with our characters, but also for us to be able to say, this detail doesn't work for me, can we change it to this? And he's like, yeah, totally. It was really nice. And it's funny because I've been running a D&D game at the youth theater that I work for. And we are trying to orient the game a lot towards having the kids describe what does that store look like, or what's the, what is this shopkeeper, bartender, or whatever, because we're trying to make it a theater exercise so that we have the barest minimum of an excuse to play D&D with children every Friday. But I'm finding it really, really nice. It engages them, and it also helps them share the spotlight with each other a little bit more, which I find is often a struggle in GM-less games because there's nobody to reach out to the person who's not participating or who is a little bit quieter and say, what do you think about this? Or what are you going to do?
Yeah. And that's sort of how I view the role of the director in a devising setting. Kind of, it's your job to bring in everyone's voice to the table, and that's why I love devising so much. Whether it's fully devising a piece or using devising exercises to stage and make a piece, because it falls back on that idea of collective brilliance, that no one person has to have all the answers, and that in fact everyone working together can make something that's much more compelling and interesting and nuanced than the sum of its parts, almost.
Mm-hmm. flipping the earlier question a bit, is there anything that you think devisers could learn from tabletop? Like, are there things in a tabletop practice or things that you've experienced in that you think would be useful for devisers who are trying to make theater?
Yeah, I think I keep coming back to the healthy boundaries, honestly, because, I was talking about, like, devising has this, I wish I could take credit for this title, but one of my very good friends in college wrote, like, a paper when we were taking, like, a second wave avant-garde class that was, all these men have god complexes and I hate it.
It's amazing.
It's so good, right? Because you hear about, like, this auteur after this auteur, and at the end of the day, it's sort of like, yeah, it's not about you. It's about the thing that you're creating, both with the people in the room and in the end, the audience. And so I think part of what I would say devisers can learn from tabletop game players is very much like the sense of play, and that it is a game, and not to take it too seriously or be too precious about it. And I think that's all built in as well. Like, that's why I love devising, because it is like, when you're making a quick and dirty composition, borrowing from, like, viewpoints, it doesn't have to be anything. Like, it just has to have the ingredients that you lay out in the recipe list, and otherwise, if it's, like, just very dumb and you can't use any part of it, that's totally fine. If you end up using, like, a small throwaway joke for you, just to make it exciting, like, that's also fine. And, like, getting away from this idea of, like, devising as, like, this, like, art for art's sake, very, like, I don't know, like, masturbatory exercise. Because, like, I've seen some pieces that were devised that I'm also like, okay, so who is this for? In terms of, like, I remember it was, I'm going to make so many people up by referencing this, but it was this production of a Shakespeare play in college, and it was really, really, like, amazingly smart in all of its creative elements, but they ended up creating this entire meta-narrative through devising without altering the text of the play itself. And so it was sort of like the meta-narrative was communicated to us, like, gradually and subliminally as we were watching it, but it was also, like, not explicit enough where when you were getting away from the text of the play or changing the ending of this particular Shakespeare play to reflect what's happening in the meta-narrative, suddenly it's like, I think you might have jumped the shark there a little bit. Like, this is for you, not necessarily for the audience to make more sense of it. Because it was like, talking to people after, it was like, oh, but of course, my character is actually in a senior care facility and grappling with his loss of control over that. And I'm like, cool, that's great. Did not get that. Like, there was, or, like, just letting things go lovingly. As a person who this is true for, I think theater people tend to take things very seriously. And I think the more we can embrace play, the better. Like, during Yellow Wallpaper, we had this composition of what we called the Ductors, which were a bunch of doctors who are also ducks. And it did not make it into the play, and I'm glad it didn't, because it was more funny for us creating it than it would have been for the audience.
I was trying to remember back, and I was like, was there a sequence where they quacked or something? But I sometimes wonder if device theater could, like, benefit from a dramaturg, and not in, like, the research sense, but in the outside eye of the audience sense.
Yes.
Like, I find that my mentor, Dr. Jessica Hester, who was a lovely woman, her view of, like, rehearsal work as a dramaturg was like, it's my job to pop in every couple of rehearsals and pretend I don't know anything about the play and say, like, what what does an audience see from this? Like, I know how the play is supposed to work. I know what these people are trying to do, but like, does it read? Is a question.
Yeah, I devised a play with children last summer for which I was the dramaturg, and that was exactly what it was. And it was so helpful in terms of just, you have all of these people with so many cool ideas, but also sometimes you don't know where to edit.
Yeah. And one of my mentors in college, James Patefield, who is a lovely director and also performance studies knowledge source, he had a very similar approach essentially to that, where it's like, my job is to come in and be an audience advocate too, to also like delight and surprise. And he drew a lot from Brecht, and it was like, to strike the audience clearly with an idea and have like that image speak out to them.
So one other thing we were thinking about was that there's sort of a bonus collaborator in any multi-person scene in tabletop games, which is the mechanics, which can give you these narratives that sort of no one could have anticipated and that not everyone wants, because you might really want to do something and then utterly fail, or the reverse. Have you ever seen or experimented with something like that in your devising practice, kind of mechanics or rules of devising?
Yes. I think, devising, for me at least, is, and prefacing all of this with that, I'm not an expert in devising. I'm just a practitioner. That mechanics are so helpful because they give structure. And again, going back to devising as rooted in playing games, every good game has to have rules. And it's related to the world that, at least what I'm listening to in session 0 that John John's building with the players, that, it's not building too much. Like, it has rules. This world has rules, and different sections of this world have different rules. But in a devising process, you probably build even less up front to play in. And it's sort of like, there's that book, Exposed by the Mask by Peter Hall, which is like, once you know the rules, you can break them. And especially when in a devising process, you might be playing 15 different kinds of games over the course of 15 days of rehearsal and like 45 hours. And the way in which all of those different rule sets intersect as you're taking bits and pieces and editing it all together is also interesting for the world of the play too. So that, every play has rules, right? That, whether it's as simple as like that we all, like one of the first rules that we all met when we started doing performance, which is like, don't turn your back to the audience. And then gradually it's like, well, actually you can, like, and, you create rules for characters within this world too. Like, my character never goes across the stage unless they have their special broom with them, or my character never goes into this is something from Storage. It's like, my character completely lives in the porn church. My character does not go in the Child Wonder junk pile, because that is not where my character lives.
There was a lot of stuff in this storage container.
Oh my god!
I don't want to know the context because porn church is so evocative on its own.
It was.
My brain is.
And like I can't even describe just the way the process that we used for that was to have devising sessions with this group of writers that we had pulled in from the community, because after our previous process, like writing the devised piece as well as devising it just proved to be like a recipe for burnout. And the world that they came up with is just incredible. And like this whole filing cabinet that we found in the storage unit was filled to the brim with like erotica and mailers from Adam and Eve and Ebony and Penthouse. And it was
what a treat.
It was a treat. It was
I mean,
treat.
I love the wild shit that happens when you just are open to whatever. Like, you mentioned Rule of Cool earlier. I think specifically that came up in part because one of the players of our campaign was like, my character runs a fighting arena in a metro car that's pulled by a demon.
Yeah, a pop-up fight club in a demon-pulled train car. Or the other one was like the plant-infused prosthetic. Like, that's so... Like, that is a direct outgrowth of two people collaborating together on something. With another person as like an outside eye to be like, yeah, that's dope as hell. Like, that's something that could not happen outside of that environment of collaboration.
Kind of riffing off that, have you found in your devising practice that there is a like upper limit for how many rules are useful? This is something I've been thinking about a lot as I look at different tabletop systems, some of which are very like bare bones, and then some have exhaustive rules for everything. So I'm just curious what you've found to be true.
Yeah. I think looking at something with a magnifying glass versus looking at the magnifying glass, like once it starts to become a play about rules, unless you want it to be a play about rules, like, then I think it's less helpful. So, like, you know, one part of the yellow wallpaper, and that is a story about this woman rebelling against all these rules that are set for her, was like gradually like overloading the audience with all the things that, like, saying overtly like, she can't do this, she can't do that, she can't do this, she can't do that, and then like watching her break those patterns and eventually get rid of that like narrative voice. So yeah, I think there's absolutely a limit. And I think, you know, the audience testing that we were all talking about is also super important for that, because like for at least these last two projects that I keep referencing, it was also built around this idea of audience interactivity to a certain extent. And so having literal play testing is really exciting to see in terms of what audiences will go with you on, because people are, you know, I think audiences are generally smart and smarter than we give them credit for often. And they'll go with you on something, but you have to just be clear and direct with them in terms of like, what exactly are you asking of me? Am I going to be safe when I do it? Like, what kind of performance art is this? To again harken back to like the bad rap that I think it sometimes deservedly gets as somebody doing it for themselves and not for telling a story in a compelling way.
I think safety is an interesting thing to bring up, and we're going to talk about safety in the context of Apocalypse World later, but I think that that's so important, and a thing that we don't talk about enough is just how do you set the audience up to feel like they can be brave and vulnerable in a space, and also how do you set your ensemble up so that they can do the same thing? Because I think we talk a lot about how art benefits from vulnerability, but not enough about how do you make that a thing that a place that people can get to where they can be giving their full self.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's such a good point. And I think it ties into some really cool work that I actually did with Ella, who's in your Apocalypse World game, because they were our intimacy director for storage. And so one of the things that we talked about when we brought them in was to say, like, safety and consent is also about a choice, like having a choice. And so having a choice for the players in a game to be like, yeah, my character's not into that, I'm not going to be there. Or like, yeah, I'm going to leave and do something else over here. Or, you know, I don't want to necessarily go along with what the group is doing in this way or this way. Having that variation of choice really helps people stay safe. I mean, it was so helpful having Ella there in general, because they created this beautiful intimacy choreography for this bizarre moment in the script that we had. Again, you know, this is a play with a porn church in it, but like we created this bizarre like mashup of found footage that we had that from the tapes and cassettes in the storage unit, and we gave them to a local burlesque performer, and he mashed them up under this Elvis song that also had been incorporated into the script. And it was just this bizarre, beautiful thing. But then when we were actually in the room, I was like, oh, great. Like, you know, we're going to have the audience circle around and like watch this thing and have the actors be doing these pieces around it, but it's really about the thing. And then, you know, somebody brought up a very good point. They're like, well, what if the audience doesn't want to watch it? Like, what if they're uncomfortable with that? And we're essentially forcing them to watch a mashup of pornography. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really good point. And so having a variety of things for the audience to look at even is, and, you know, I think we also had one or two actors who were also a little uncomfortable with that, like being forced to watch it. And so even being able to have them to say to them, okay, we're going to honor and respect that boundary. And, you know, you're also doing this thing over here that the audience can look at and enjoy and take in the context of everything else. Like that's super important.
So one of the mechanics built into Apocalypse World is that the world building and the character creation is all done collaboratively at the table together. What benefits do you think this might have for the rest of the gameplay, and how do you feel this might relate to devising theater in general?
It's sort of like that game Exquisite Corpse too, where, you know, you've got this writing exercise ostensibly where everyone's completing a different part of it. Like at the end of session 0, when the players are really going around and forming that connective tissue, that to me is just something that's hugely rich, because that again is where these things kind of organically spring up, and it makes it really less about writing the script and more about editing what you've already made together. Because of course, like with any role playing, it's not about like, this is the plot, we're railroading you all on this road to this eventual conclusion, because I think that'd be a lot less interesting and a lot less fun than all of the idiosyncratic, weird, delightful things that can come up in the meantime.
One thing that I remember being really energized by when we were doing the part at the end where you assigned like relationship stats basically was how easy it was to, like, it was very obvious from the process who was close with who and what the dynamics were, which I thought was really interesting, that it felt so effortless. Like it just always was there, which I imagine is a experience common in devising, which I've not done a lot of, but just you look and you're like, oh, like we got it. Like we just to put it together, which is really, really cool and exciting. No,
and it made me think about devising a bunch, because like devising is a very, I find it to be a very time intensive endeavor. And the reason why that was so rich is that because you all had the space to explore like all these truths about your characters before that. Like if you had flipped the order of that and started with the history mechanic, it would have been so much less rich and so much less to echo what you said, Percy, that like it was sort of like not a foregone conclusion, but it was like so clear and so exciting that it was so clear that it was like, oh yeah, like that totally makes sense. Like as an audience member coming along for the ride, it was like, oh yeah, like that I completely agree with that, with what the players just did. And that in and of itself is like an also interesting, like rewarding thing that, oh, like this is like, I can definitely picture this.
That's so exciting that it is, because I found it so engaging just as an artist, as a player, for us to just spend 3 hours like shooting the shit about our characters. And I'm like, yeah, I was like, oh, is this masturbatory? But no, like I don't know. As an audience member, I always like being let in on the process. I like feeling like I am a part of the creation of something, or at least like I get a window in. So yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, like
so
that's what
fun.
makes like all the best parts of tabletop are those moments. I think that where like something goes delightfully off the rails too, like in the actual play.
that happens a lot.
It can feel masturbatory, and yet at the same time, it also, like, when I approach a process, like, as a director and as an actor, it also, like, takes the pressure way off, because I'm beginning to know, like, not just the characters that these people are playing, but the people themselves too, which just makes you a better collaborator. And like, it adds so much that is intangible to the process in the long run.
Yeah, and I think circling back a little bit to safety, it builds so much trust, which is really valuable, especially in a game like Apocalypse World, where it is so open-ended that you don't have, because I feel like in D&D, because the stories are so often like, escort the guy to the city or go kill the monster and then come back and get your reward. Like, Apocalypse World isn't like that at all. So we just didn't, like, it felt okay that we didn't know what was going to happen or what was the quote unquote right thing to do, because we knew there wasn't a right thing to do, and also I had a good idea of what everybody else in the game wanted character-wise or what they as players were interested in. So I felt like, okay, if I don't know what to do, somebody else probably will. And that was really nice.
Exactly. Which is, like, honestly embodying your character. That, like, it stops. Like, I am somebody who is a little guilty of this in my tabletop games, where I'm like, okay, I'll metagame my way out of this. And being able to stop that impulse and just be in the moment and embody the character that you're in, because you can trust everybody else in your group to help figure it out in a fun way is like, that's aces. That's amazing. Yeah. It's been delightful talking to you all. I mean, I could talk about all this for forever. So this is really, really rad.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And next week, we'll be diving back into Apocalypse World. Thanks for listening, folks. Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percy Hornak, and Nick Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out our cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds. Boop, boop, boo, doo, doo, bow, bow, now, now.
I'm gonna stop recording.
Boop, boop, boop.